Good afternoon, beautiful people. Welcome to another episode of Kiko's Freethinkers Forum. We are at episode 84, and we're joined by a four-time guest. His name is Dr. Jack Rasmus. He probably doesn't need an introduction at this point, but I'm still going to give him a brief introduction. Dr. Jack Rasmus, he's a retired professor from St. Mary's University, Moraga, California, author of so many books. You should check out his website at drjackrasmus.com. We previously talked about his book, The Scourge of Neoliberalism, U.S. Economic Policy from Reagan to Bush. I almost said Trump for a second, but we ended up talking about so many, in betweens with that book, with neoliberalism, and that we also talked about Russia, Ukraine. We've talked about various topics over these previous three episodes. I recommend my audience to go back and check out episodes 30, 56, and 72 with Dr. Jack Rasmus. And today, episode 84, we're going to talk about a very important topic, a topic that we haven't touched on a ton on the forum, which is unions and strikes, in particular the UAW strike. And we just want to say from Kiko's Freethinkers Forum to you, Dr. Jack Rasmus, welcome back to the show.
Always my pleasure to join you.
Yes, and just a brief advertisement before we start. This channel is officially monetized. Kiko's Freethinkers Forum is officially monetized. You don't have to give money. Again, you're not going to hear me say like donate or give me money. I always say that it's available, but never anything explicit, because the point of the forum is really just to educate the people. I see this as a classroom outside of the classroom that we're accustomed to. That my background is in Spanish, Latin American literature, Caribbean literature, but I want to take the expertise that I have to offer and bring on a variety of guests in their respective fields, whether it be activists, professors, everyday people, or you never know who you're going to get on this show. And I think that's part of the intrigue of the show, is because there's such a variety of topics that we cover. And so I just want to say thank you to all the beautiful listeners out there. We've reached over 165 different countries, all 50 states in just 16 months time. And you can subscribe for free to Kiko's Freethinkers Forum on our YouTube channel. Please encourage people to subscribe for free on that channel. It doesn't cost you a dime, just a little bit of your time to expand your mind. And remember, you can't unthink free thought. So let's get started with the topic at hand today, which is unions. But I want to bring Jack's experience into this, because he told me something off air a couple of episodes previous. And I said, we have to talk about this in the fourth episode today. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to start out talking about his background, his personal connection with unions. Can you please tell the audience your perspectives coming from the background that you come from as it pertains to unions?
Yeah, well, I grew up very working class. Both of my parents were factory workers. Neither graduated from high school. I was lucky enough, right place, right time, to get a football scholarship, or else I wouldn't have gone to college either. So this was the 60s, and I could kick a football, so I got lucky. And the only person in my family graduated from high school and went to college. But I've always been working class, grew up very much working class. And when I graduated from college, I had an experience in which I was exposed to my roots once again, and with the Steelworkers Union. And I began hanging out with them. And I did some research for them, and they taught me organizing. So I became a union organizer, taught by some of the best, and that's where I went. I didn't go, immediately into academia. That would come later. Years later, I would finish up, get a PhD, and go into academia. But my early years, my youthful years, were spent at the grassroots as a union organizer for 4 different unions at different times, steelworkers, and then service employees workers, hotel, restaurant, bartenders workers union, and then the Communication Workers of America, where I became a elected union president, local union president. And I learned everything from the bottom up. I was not some academic staff guy. I was in the weeds and learned everything from the bottom up as an organizer, as a representative, handling grievances and contract matters, negotiated many contracts, organized a couple thousand workers and built my own union here on the West Coast, and coordinated strikes and did arbitrations and did the whole thing from the bottom up. And then later in life, once I entered academia, I joined the National Writers Union. I was the first national vice president of the National Writers Union for a while. So about 15 years during a very formative phase of my life, I was very much pro-union. Union was everything to me. I was married to the union, you might say. And that means 12-hour work days, 7 days a week. Because the union that I built from scratch, from 3 members to 2,000 members, was what they call an amalgamated union. In other words, you had it wasn't just one company, one location. There were many different companies, and each one you organized, and each one you negotiated a contract. Sometimes you had to strike, and there were some real strikes back in those days that we had. One went at least 6 months. And there's quite a bit of difference when you're in a 2 or 3 day strike, or a 1 or 2 week strike, or even a month strike and a 6-month strike. And I've been in all of them. So my background is very much pro-union, and I am an absolute 101% union supporter. And that reflects my views on this. But over the course of the decades and years, I was able to become a labor economist eventually. When I went back, at the end of my 15 years there, I had a family and kids and everything. And, you can't really, as a union organizer or union representative, it's a 12-hour workday. There's no family time, really. If you're doing your job, there's no family time. If you want to skate, and just go through the motions, a lot of people do in the union movement. I had a good friend who once told me, and I always remembered, he was kind of up there in the machinist union, and he said, Jack, after 10 years, you ain't worth a damn doing this work. And, you got to stay young and full of energy and commitment. And he said, you ought to retire after 10 years. Well, I went about 15 and then had a family and decided I needed to raise the family. And by that time, I had finished my PhD and, went off into market research and then academia. I didn't get into academia until I was over 50 years old. It's kind of strange way to enter. A lot of people enter academia as a young assistant professors, about 25 years old. They finish their PhD and everything, and then they go get a job, and they've got to play the bureaucratic academic university college games, and they tend to be very academic, very petty, very bureaucratic. And I saw that, and I said, I don't want none of this. But when I was much older, I went into academia as a labor economist in order to buy some time in order to write my books. I got like 8, 9 books that I've written in the last decade, and another one forthcoming about the material bases of the decline of the American empire. So that's another topic someday we can talk about, because we're in the midst of that, witnessing the beginnings of that right now. But that's a totally different topic. And you can read my articles that I write on the economy and that topic, and fiscal monetary policy and neoliberalism and the recessions and so forth on my blog, jackrasmus.com, jackrasmus.com. You can get to my books there from the roll on the right-hand side. And you can follow me on Twitter. I write a lot on Twitter nowadays, day-to-day events on Twitter. at Dr. Jack Rasmus. So join me there if you want to follow my views on the economy, inflation and recession, soft landing, and all this talk going on now, and the wars that are going on. I'm a political economist, not just a theoretician. So that's the best place to catch me on my blog or on Twitter. And of course, on YouTube, I do a lot of interviews with a lot of different sources, including yours here. So that's pretty much my background. And my union years have really influenced the way I look at what's happening to the working class in this country and the union segment of that class. And the number one takeaway from that view is that starting in the late 70s, what began to occur was called concession bargaining. Okay, we'll talk about what that means. And that's been going on for 4 decades. And this past year, I'm sure your audience has noticed in the news the unions and the strikes and the contract settlements, the auto workers, the latest one. But before that, the Teamsters settled, the longshore workers, what's going on with the actors and writers in Hollywood. That's another important event. Before that, the railroad workers about a year ago. These are the big 5 or 6 negotiated union contract settlements. And the number one question is concession bargaining over? Concession bargaining is when the unions give up what they already had achieved in previous years. They concede, they give things back. It's a give back. And that really began in the late 70s. The sort of threshold case was the Chrysler auto workers strike in 1979, where for the first time the union had to give back big time a lot of what it had won. And this concession bargaining, particularly in the manufacturing sector and construction sector, had been going on for over 4 decades. And the question is, with these negotiations and settlements this past year, is it ending? Is concession bargaining ending? This era I called the Great Detour for union labor and union workers. Is it over? And there are some signs that yes, it is, but there's some signs that, well, it's early. It's too early to tell. We can talk about that. I'll go over these contract settlements a little bit later on, and give you some details from a union negotiator point of view. If you read the media, New York Times and all this stuff, you're not going to get a good view of what actually goes on. And the union's attempt to communicate gets filtered out. You don't really get the view of what's actually going on in these negotiations, in these strikes. As much as the union and the leadership may try to communicate it to the public, it gets filtered out. The media, the mainstream media, is corporations, big corporations, and face it, we get a lot of propaganda from them. We get a lot of filtered news from them. A lot of news is not communicated to us. And that's especially true when it comes to unions and working class. Here, the media is really on the side of the business and the corporations. Right? So I'll try to give you a union view of what I think has happened in these key negotiations, because we're kind of at a threshold of a change here, not just in the country, but in the labor movement. It's still early, hard to tell how it's going to turn out, but very clearly what's gone down the past year in these major negotiations is a change, a significant change, particularly in some of the bigger unions. There's new leadership now, and that leadership is more militant. I wouldn't over exaggerate that term, militant, in their case. Certainly was better before, although before is a very low bar in the union movement. A lot of these guys just sort of did whatever the company wanted. These guys, meaning the leadership, prior leadership in unions like auto workers and Teamsters and so forth. But let's step back and try to understand the history a little bit. Put it in context. The labor movement in this country really grew up in the 30s and 40s. The big gains in membership and the big gains in contract rights and so forth really occurred in the 30s and even more so in the 40s during the war. They had, the war was being fought, and they needed the political leadership in this country needed a lot of production. And for that, they needed labor peace. And for that, you had to find a way, you, meaning the country, had to find a way to allow these demands for unionization to occur. People aren't aware, but during World War II, to get a union, all you had to do was sign a little 3x5 card or a petition. And if a majority of the workers in the factory or wherever the business was signed a petition, well, then you got a union. It was that simple, right? Well, that's the way the government ensured that there would be labor peace during World War II. And of course, when you got a union, the union negotiated wage increases. And on top of that, you got all the work you could need and want. I mean, you could work overtime as much as you wanted. You could work 60, 70 hours a week if you wanted, wartime, right? And a lot of workers did and made a lot more money by working a lot of extra hours and some wage increases. Not a lot big wage increases, but some wage increases. So the working class unionization, the biggest wave of unionization, people joining a union, occurred during World War II this way. There were some gains during the 1930s, but those were hard-fought gains, fighting against the companies to get the companies to voluntarily recognize the union, meaning sit down and negotiate with the union. And only one union, before the 1935 Wagner Act, National Labor Relations Act, one of the ways the employers kept unions out was that they created their own company unions. And there were maybe a whole bunch of unions in a company, factory, claiming to represent the workers and negotiate for them. And, the employers played one against the other in order to prevent the unionization, or they would only negotiate with the company-dominated union formed by their foreman. Right. So that's one way. Another way was they hired a lot of goons to beat people up. A lot of violence during the 30s. People trying to form unions, in the steel industry and the auto industry, meat packing and all that. That kind of violence disrupts production, of course. And the government stepped in World War II and said, no, we're just going to have a card check. In other words, you sign a union card, company gives us, the government, a list of all the employees. Do you have a majority of them signed up with a card? Okay, you got a union. I'll sit down and negotiate. And the employers were willing to negotiate during World War II because there's a lot of money to be made from government contracts, right? They didn't want strikes. And they were able to pay more wages because they had all these contracts and the economy was booming. So they were more amenable to signing an agreement. In the defense industries, whatever the cost of labor was, the government agreed to give them, the companies, a 7% markup. So, we had this phenomenon, the companies were hiring people they really didn't need because they make 7% on them. I remember my family saying, yeah, we got guys in the factory they hired and to sweep the floors. And they sweep them from one end of the plant to the other end. And they just do that all day long, keep sweeping the floors. So that's what's called cost push or cost of, the wages, whatever. Well, that was a unique environment during World War II. Okay. And when World War II finished, the unions were quite powerful. Unions had maybe 35% of the workforce unionized, and in those days it didn't include public the public sector. They had no unions yet, right? And other sectors of the economy. It was all, manufacturing, construction. It was a very industrial country at that time. So 35%. And in some industries, the basic industries, like steel and auto and meat packing and so forth, transport, it was like 80-90% were unionized. Okay, that's pretty powerful bargaining position. So after the war, World War II, the Republicans and right wing and conservative Dixiecrats, whatever, from the South got together and they passed an anti-union law in 1947. That was called Taft-Hartley, the Taft-Hartley Act. And that was added to the basic law of labor relations passed during the 1930s, the Wagner Act. Now, the Taft-Hartley Act really attacked unions' right to strike in a lot of ways. You couldn't strike in sympathy for, at another company. You couldn't refuse to, if you were a Teamster, refuse to haul the goods of a company that was on strike, maybe even for a different union. Sympathy strikes, sit-down strikes were, like in the 30s, they were outlawed. And the government stepped in and said for the first time, if there's a strike that affects national interest, like a steel strike or something, or trucker strike, then the company, the government would force the union to have a 30-day cooling off period. In other words, you got to go back to work for 30 days. And you had to notify whenever your contract expired and you were going on strike. You had to notify the new government agency called Federal Mediation to step in to try to resolve the strike. Foremen could no longer be in unions. You couldn't have wildcat strikes, etc. There was a whole host of ways to prevent strikes, to put restrictions on striking in that 1947 law, the Taft-Hartley Act. And it stopped unions in their tracks. And the growth of union membership after that was only because you had a growth of the industry. In other words, the demand and the production increased and the companies had to hire more people in the early 50s and so forth. So that was a very important development that showed that the state would step in on behalf of the employers to have a better, quote, level playing field, because the unions in some cases became stronger than the employers. All right. Now, the employers were not global yet. You see, this is all within the U.S. So this idea of moving their production offshore as a way weakening unions had not begun to occur yet. That would occur in the 1970s. Now, people don't understand, working people don't understand their history. I just gave you a bit of a quick overview from the 30s to the 70s. By the 1970s, 69, 70, 71, we had a massive strike wave in this country, bigger than the post-World War II strike wave in some measures. That occurred in 46, right? But the biggest strike wave in this country occurred in 70, 71. And the unions won massive gains in 70, 71. It started with the construction workers, and they had regional contracts then, like all of Northern California or whatever was all under construction workers contract, and all the construction trades were involved, together in it. And the construction employers tend to be smaller employers. They could not resist the construction unions when they had regional agreements like that. Well, they walked off first. And then, of course, when you have strikes in construction and big gains, who delivers the materials to the construction site? The Teamsters, right? So the Teamsters workers say, well, construction workers are getting these big gains. We want them too. And you had then big gains in the trucking industry, construction and trucking. And then it spilled over from there to the basic manufacturing, auto workers and steel workers, and then longshore workers, dock workers and so forth. And the unions achieved, listen to this, the unions achieved gains of 25% wage increase in the first year of a 3-year contract. 25%. Think about that. Would you like a 25% wage increase? Yeah, well, if you were in the unions back in 70, 71, that's what you would get, 25%. And the contracts were only 3 years, and you get a little bit of a dip in the second and third year and benefit increases and so forth. Well, the companies couldn't stop them. And when I say companies, I mean big companies like GM and US Steel and whatever. They couldn't stop the unions. Right? The union power was so great because they had virtually their whole industry unionized, right? 35, 40%. Well, even more than that, as I said, in the basic industries, 80, 90% that I just mentioned. Well, what happened was the state got involved again. The state, meaning the national government, stepped in again. Richard Nixon was in office, and Richard Nixon passed a wage freeze, a 90-day wage freeze, and a rollback of those 25% increases that were negotiated from strikes, rolled them back after the freeze of 90 days, stopped the negotiation wave in its tracks, and then ruled that on a wage board bureaucrats that were set up after the 90-day freeze ruled that the 25% was rolled back to 5.5%. In other words, the state had to step in on behalf of the employers once again in 1970-71. This was actually 71. In August of 71, his 90-day wage price freeze was implemented. And then after that, immediately after that, we had 2 years of the pay board, as it was called. Now, there was a price commission that was supposed to hold down prices too, but it really was pretty phony. It said, we're going to hold prices to 2% on average for all companies and for all goods and services. Well, that essentially meant no price increases because, you got millions of goods and services prices, and millions of them are not increased. Maybe just a couple tens of thousands of items are increased in price. So you can keep the wage very low. And there was another way of getting out of it called the profit rule. You could raise prices as much as you want if you could show your profits were increased significantly as a result. So it was phony, but the pay board was not phony. It was easy to control contract negotiations and major union collective bargaining agreements involving 5,000 workers or more. How do I know all this? Well, because I eventually wrote my PhD thesis on this. On this strike wave and the wage price freeze and all that, and really got into the weeds on understanding what went down. And years later, I think it was 1979 when the wage price freeze and controls were ended. I think it's 73-4 because we had a deep recession. They didn't need them. Didn't need to control wages in the deep recession. But by 1979, the guys who ran the pay board admitted publicly in the Time magazine piece that, look, the whole idea of the pay board was to zap labor, and we did. And they used that word, to zap labor, quote unquote, and we did. So, the state stepped in and stopped unions in their track. And from that point on, they began developing ways. So, well, how can we hold down union labor more permanently here? I mean, we can't keep throwing these wage freezes and pay boards at people here. So what happened in the 70s was the employers got together and formed the Construction Industry Business Council. This was the big construction employers. They got together and they decided on a strategy. How can we break the power of the construction unions? And they did so legally by getting court decisions that prevented striking and picketing at construction sites. You could only have two people holding picket signs at construction sites, right? And they also then, the employers then set up what they call double-breasted operations. In other words, in the big cities where you had construction and offices and so forth, that would be union, but they would creep in non-union construction companies by in the outlying areas where you're home building and so forth. They would form a separate parallel company that would only hire non-union people. And that's called double-breasted, two kind of companies, one non-union. It's the same company, but non-union operation and a union operation. And the unions kind of went along with that because, as long as we can cover, the big cities, that's fine. But over time, the employers grew the non-union and they shrunk the other. So that was their strategy, as well as limit picketing and the ability to strike. That they broke the power of the construction unions that had led that charge in 69 and 70. Now, how to break the power of the manufacturing unions, right, is the next question. And that's concession bargaining. And you set up the manufacturing unions for concession bargaining in two ways. One way was you start offshoring jobs, right? And people get worried about their job security, and they don't want to strike for better wages and so forth because they're afraid to lose their jobs. Well, Ronald Reagan helped that. Ronald Reagan did that, right? Mason and the Democrats went along with it. Unfortunately, the beginning of concession bargaining in the Chrysler strike of '79. Occurred because the then Democratic president, Jimmy Carter, leaned on the leadership of the auto workers, Douglas Fraser, president then, and they leaned on the workers to settle and give up all these big gains of the previous years, decades going on. The auto workers was the #1 union in terms of the contract that they had. It was a wonderful contract. They had top wages in the industry. And in the industry in general, all manufacturing. They had cost of living adjustments that pretty much made up any inflation. They were going to be protected from it by their COLA, as it's called, cost of living adjustment, right? They had pensions where it was called 30 and out. In other words, if you worked for 30 years, in the auto industry, no matter what your age was. Maybe you went to work at 20 on assembly line and you had your 30 years when you were 50 years old. You could retire with a full pension. And the pension was like 3/4 at least of your base wage, right? Think about it. Retiring after 30 years at age 50, with 3/4, and then you got Social Security on top of that, right? You had almost your full pay, right? And there were other. I won't go over them. A lot of other terms in that contract that were just wonderful. It was a wonderful contract. Well, concession bargaining over the next 4 decades, after 1979, they gave up a lot of that. Most of that was given up. The COLA was given up. Cost of living adjustment. The pensions were given up. So concession bargaining means you give back. And that's because the unions were weak. They were weak because their jobs were being sent offshore by these companies. The auto companies, well, they did two things. They moved to Mexico in a lot of cases, or they moved to the South where there were no unions, right, in the South. And the southern states had, to the extent there were unions in the southern states at a state level passed what's called right to work laws, which is a euphemism for no one can be required to join the union, right? Typically in a union contract, after 30 days, your probation period, you join the union, right? You have to join the union, you pay dues, you join the union, and that keeps the union strong. Everybody there is in the union. No freeloaders. Like it or not, you got to join the union, pay your share, because the union's got to negotiate for everybody, not just union members. right? That's called a union shop. But when you have right to work laws like in the Tennessee where you are and places like that, I think there's like 26 states have right to work law, maybe more. Then by law, a union cannot negotiate a clause that says you must join the union. That's called an open shop, and that weakens the union and it weakens negotiations. So that was one way unions were weakened with the right to work laws. Another way was they shifted their jobs offshore. The companies did not reinvest in the factories, in the North and Midwest. They built factories offshore in Mexico, right? Or they built them in the South. Foreign auto companies, when they came into the U.S., the Japanese and Germans, they built them in the South, right, where there were no unions. And then they keep the unions out by paying their workers just about the same that the unionized workers get, right? They just up their wages to match it and keep the unions out, and a lot of other tactics too that they use. But why did the jobs get offshore? Is the next question. Starting in the 80s under Ronald Reagan. Well, Congress passed laws, tax cut laws for businesses that said, if you build your factory in Mexico now, you can get a big tax cut, right? Big tax cut, 7%, 10%. And we'll give you the tax cut just for saying that you're going to build it. We won't even wait to see whether you build it. We'll just give you that 10% tax cut. Well, that's a big advantage. And of course, you go to move your factory to Mexico, right? You pay a lot less for wages in Mexico. You don't have to worry about safety laws, job safety laws, and environmental laws, and all that. And the company's profitability, increased tremendously. There was one more problem, though, and that was, so you're going to put your factory in Mexico, and you're going to create all these jobs in Mexico at a lower wage. Well, what about the cars? You're going to have to bring the cars back to the U.S. to sell them here, right? Mexicans are going to buy all those cars. Well, for that, you need a free trade agreement. Mm-hmm. You need a NAFTA. You need a free trade agreement, which means you can bring those goods across the border without paying a tax called the tariff, right? So you see, you got a trade law and you got a tax law that the Congress pays, and we vote these people in to move our jobs, right? Effectively, workers vote for these people, and then these people take their jobs away from them. Of course, they can't see this that clearly, that all this is happening, and the media does not explain it to them, right? So what you got was, starting in the 80s, massive offshoring of jobs, particularly in manufacturing. That was a big development. And that continued and accelerated when you got these free trade agreements. The first free trade agreement was with Canada in 1989. And that was quickly followed by an even greater free trade agreement under Democrat Bill Clinton with Mexico, right? And then there was, in the late 90s, a deal with China. And most of these jobs went to Mexico or China. Some other jobs, with the Caribbean countries, like the textile union work. We used to have a big textile industry here in the Carolinas. Well, that pretty much went to Caribbean, Dominican Republic, and even Africa, right? Where they moved it all offshore. We used to produce high quality clothing and shoes in New England. Well, that all went to Indonesia and places like that, right? But you got to remember, the big incentives were the tax system and the trade system. They gave companies an incentive to move offshore, right? Well, we lost a lot of manufacturing union jobs, under what was neoliberalism. This is part of neoliberalism. We talked about that, starting with Reagan, right? And then Bill Clinton, and then George Bush. Free trade agreements, tax cuts for businesses kept coming, and the jobs kept going. Well, when you lose all those jobs, right, the union loses power to negotiate, right? Because the union members are just terrified about losing their jobs, and They don't want to strike. They want to keep what they can. And that weakens the ability of the union to really take on the company. And that's what happened in manufacturing and other sectors that could be offloaded or offshored. Right. Other ways that unions were weakened in starting in the 80s was the creation of part-time temp jobs. Up until the 1980s, there were virtually no temp jobs, no part-time jobs. There were some, in retail and so forth, part-time jobs by choice, not involuntary part-time, voluntary part-time, right? But there were no temp jobs because union contracts would not allow temp jobs, right? Second-class working citizens who didn't get benefits, who had a different wage structure. A wage structure is your starting wage, and then after 1 year you get a wage increase, 2 years and 3 years. That's called a wage structure, right? Well, starting in 1980s with temps, we got a 2 year, a two-tier wage structure starting, and some people were hired in the lower tier, and the people who were there before were kept in the higher tier. So you had two kinds of work citizens, first class and second class. And of course, that divided the labor force quite a bit. But the companies made a lot of money off of the second tier because they didn't pay them as much as the older employees who were there before, full-time employees, temporary employees, part-time temporary employees often, right? You didn't pay them not just equivalent wages, but you didn't give them benefits. And they couldn't be in the union, right? They were kept out of the union. Contracts would be negotiated where it indicated the employer could hire 20, 30% of its labor force temporary, and they would not have to join the union at all. Right. In some contracts, they would join, maybe after a year. Well, the companies dealt with that by simply at 11 months, they got rid of all those temps and brought in a whole bunch of new temps, right? So they got around it that way. All this bottom line meant the companies made a lot of money off union contracts this way. They increased their power and their finances, by creating two-tier. Another favorite concession change was, instead of giving workers a wage increase when they negotiated a contract, we'll give them a lump sum. In other words, we'll give you $5,000 instead of raising your wage structure, which over 3 years you would have got $10,000, right? We'll give you $5,000 up front. And of course, that was a big attraction to workers, who were falling behind because of inflation and the lack of wage increases, to get that money to be able to buy that car and get to work now because the other one was falling apart, right? So that was another tactic that the employers used. Still, an additional tactic was they wanted to get rid of pensions. Up until Reagan and the 1980s, we had what were called defined benefit pensions. This is like this 30 years and out thing that the auto workers used to have. A defined benefit pension said that the company had to put money in a pension fund, a company pension fund, which was overseen by a committee that included union members, right? A company pension fund. They had to put money in it enough to guarantee that when workers retired, they would get so much pay per year of service. Maybe $50 a month per year of service. Well, if you had 30 years, $50 a month, that's $1,500 pension, right? And that was guaranteed. In other words, it didn't matter if the company didn't have profits that year, they still had to pay into that defined benefit, right? Pension plan. Those were real pensions. They only exist today in the public sector, teachers and state workers and so forth, city workers. They're the only ones that have that left, because part of this whole development, anti-union development since the 80s on, was to replace those defined benefit pensions, real pensions, with what's called defined contribution pensions, sometimes known as 401ks, right? Now, the thing about 401ks is that the company isn't required to put a certain amount every year on your behalf in that, that defined contribution plan for you. They can if they want. They can suspend it if they want. They can provide less if they want. It's totally up to them. But the most important thing about it was that employers could use the money you put in to expand their stock, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these 401ks, you could only buy company stock, right? So that was a nice way of boosting the company stock. But even more important than that, defined contribution plans, 401ks, have no liability on the company. In other words, if the company goes broke or the company doesn't want to, you're not going to get any pension if they don't want to put any money in it, right? It's their choice. Whereas the old defined benefit plans, company it had a liability. It had to put this into the pension fund, right? 401ks, it doesn't have to. There's no liability on the company, right? So that's a way of getting rid of the cost of pensions, not just keeping wages down by offshoring jobs, right? Or creating part-time temp workers, right? There's lots of ways you can compress wages. And that's what began in the 80s and ever since. That's all concession bargaining that's been going on from the 1979, that key case, that key strike, and it debilitated union membership. In 1980, union membership was probably around 22 to 24% of all the labor force in this country. It had been declining during the 70s from the peak, right? But the real decline began starting in the 1980s once again. And all these trends continue through Republican and Democrat administrations. They're all in agreement. Both these parties are in agreement on this. One talks like it isn't, Democrats, but their actions speak the words. Over the years, union membership collapsed in the private sector, right? Private sector meaning not government, right? Not teachers. That's government. That's called the public sector. But in the private sector, the membership declined from this 25% to today it's only 6%. Only 6% of the private sector is unionized.
Mm.
I mean, that's really a significant destruction of union labor, right? And unions, because they were so weak and getting weaker, they lost their bargaining power, and they couldn't. They get pushed along in these negotiations, giving more and more concessions because they're so weak, and that's continued. And you can look at wages, you can look at benefits. They gave up COLA, cost of living adjustments, health insurance. Well, they shifted the cost of health insurance from the companies to the workers and their families, raised premiums, increased co-pays, reduced the amount of coverage that you could get, eliminated your dependence coverage, and so forth, right? And then, in many cases, by 2000, there were like 50 million people that didn't have insurance. Well, then Obama comes along with this Affordable Care Act, and he comes up with this thing put together called the ACA, Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, whatever, and with a series of patchwork ways of providing financing, costs $900 billion a year, and they are able to provide insurances, health insurance for people for maybe 10, 15 million of those 50 million. We still have tens of millions of people uninsured, and they cost us $900 billion a year to provide, a little bit of insurance. And that's been getting worse and worse because the monthly premiums are going up and the deductibles are going up even on that. It's no solution, but it was really a way of blunting all this call for, let's just take Medicare and give it to everybody. Medicare is a great system. I'm on Medicare. I don't pay anything. Well, I have a monthly about $160 or whatever, you know, deductible or premiums, but when it comes to, major expenses, I don't pay virtually anything on Medicare, right? And we got like 45 million people in that capacity, and it's very efficient because there's no middlemen. If you look at our private health insurance system, we pay like 18-19% of our total GDP in a year, which is like $25 trillion, right? 18-19% of 25 trillion for our private medical care. And over $1 trillion, is paid to the health insurance companies to push paper around, right? For these private health insurance. They push paper around. They don't provide one iota of healthcare services, but we pay them essentially $1 trillion plus a year, 17-18% of our GDP. Other countries provide half of that, who have like a Medicare for all solution, right? So these insurance companies are getting filthy rich off of insurance costs. Right? I could talk about insurances all day long, auto insurances, home insurances, and so forth. It's a big ripoff, right? But anyway, part of this concession bargaining was to make workers pay more and more, even union contracts, for less and less of healthcare services. And as I said, getting rid of real pensions, replacing them with 401ks, right? A real pension you can live off of, by the way, with Social Security. But the average amount that people have when they retire in a 401k plan is about $50,000. And if you take everybody in the labor force, how much do they have on average in 401ks? About $18,000, $20,000. Now, you can't retire at $50,000. There's no way. You cannot pay. You have one operation that's gone, right? Then if you're lucky, you got a house and you can refinance that. And then after that, tough luck. That's the healthcare system in this country, right? Well, anyway, concession bargaining is giving up benefits as well as giving up wages.
Mm-hmm.
Giving up pension benefits, healthcare benefits, wages and wage compression. And it's all made possible because the unions are weak. In the private sector, only 6%. There are a few islands here and there where, unions still have some density, as they call it, some composition that they can have some influence. But, the auto workers used to have 2 million members. What do they got today? 300,000-400,000 maybe?
Mm-hmm.
And now that we're going electric cars, they're going to be a lot fewer because you don't need as many parts for an electric car, and therefore you're not going to need as many workers to build them. That's why in these recent auto worker negotiations, the auto worker unions, one of the big demands was you recognize the union in these new electric vehicle and battery plants, right? So at least we get to negotiate something for our workers as they get displaced because of the electric car revolution, which will reduce jobs, you see. It doesn't matter if the companies give you a 10% wage increase if they're going to take it back by laying off workers.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's going to happen. That's their plan. They look long term, 5 years. They know what the whole cost picture is going to be after 5 years, and you can agree to things up front if you're going to change them after the third or fourth year, right? And your total cost is not going to be what they report it to be. Like you get this big billions of dollars, this auto solution, billions of dollars. Well, they're going to take a lot of that back when they lay people off and they switch over to electric vehicles, right? It's not going to cost them that. By the way, in the auto industry, just sort of plug this in your mind, the auto companies admit that wages and labor costs is only 10% of a car. 10% of total car cost is only for labor. Think about that, 10%. And think about the fact since 2019, the average cost of a car has risen $10,000. You know, if you bought a car in 2019 for 35,000, that same car on average, you know, costs 45,000, right? So they've raised their cost, you know, the price, $10,000, but only 10% of that is labor. Only 10%. So wage increases don't cause the rise in the cost of a car, and that's true for many industries. It's not wages. Wages have been compressed and held down, you know, quite a bit across the board. So wages aren't responsible for this inflation. You know, there's other responses like corporate price gouging, monopolistic corporate price gouging, supply chain problems, both domestic and global. And other reasons. I've written about this quite a bit, you know, what's really behind the inflation. You can read in my various articles, anatomy, inflation, and so forth on my blog, jackrasmus.com. So just check that out. And or listen to my radio show. I have my own radio show, Alternative Visions, on the Progressive Radio Network on Fridays. This Friday, I'll be talking, it's at 11 o'clock Pacific time. This Friday, I'll be talking about the just released inflation numbers and why they are grossly underestimated. Inflation is much worse than they're reporting it, and I'll explain why. So if you're interested in that topic, you can check that out. But getting back to labor, you know, summing up what I've just said, and before we go on to these other contract negotiations, summing it up, you know, for 40 years, starting in the late 70s, employers put together a strategy to bring union labor to its knees. And it worked. It pretty much worked. Well, where does this come from? What do you mean the employers? Well, you remember I mentioned there was this Construction Industry Business Council that went after the construction unions. Well, by the mid-late 70s, the big companies got together and expanded that to what was called this new organization called the Business Council. 100 of the CEOs, 100 CEOs of the largest companies in America formed the Business Council, just the CEOs, right? And they developed position papers and they developed a strategy that they pushed on Jimmy Carter, who implemented part of it, but their whole strategy for taming the unions and other reasons was implemented by Ronald Reagan. The Business Council proposed all this offshoring and all these 401ks and all the part-time temp and all the tax cuts and all the free trade deals. This comes out of the Business Council that formed a parallel organization called the Business Roundtable. And the Business Roundtable is a lobbying extension of the Business Council. This is big capitalists in this country, right? They came together in the 70s and they decided what they're going to do long term to break the power of the unions that I talked about, right? And we've been living under that ever since, right? This is class conflict, right? Or as Warren Buffett, this big capitalist investor in Nebraska, said, "Oh, this is a class war, and you know what? My side's winning."
Mm-hmm.
This is what he said during George Bush. You know, it was obvious even then, and it's true. You know, when workers talk about class war, you know, we got to get tough and militant. They say, "Oh, you can't do that." You know, class war. That's not allowed, taboo. Right. Well, the capitalists themselves say, "Well, we believe in it." Right.
Yeah, right.
And by the way, we're winning. You know, once in a while it slips through the media what they're really thinking and planning. Right. So we've been living under this class war, intensified class war, which is very lopsided on behalf of corporations and their politician friends that they put in office. Because under the 2010 Supreme Court decision, you know, Citizens United, spending money on campaign contributions is free speech. and corporations are people. Yeah, that's what our great Supreme Court has decided, actually quite some time ago. Corporations are people and have all the rights of people. The problem with corporations being people is that, they are immortal, not like the rest of us, they can just keep going and going. But there's free speech. In other words, you can't interfere. People have right of free speech, right? First Amendment of the Constitution, right? Well, their form of free speech is spending money on politicians. You can't interfere with that, right? And we got the kind of government we got as a result, big time, of that money. Open up the spigot, and let the rich buy the politicians as never before. They had to do it, very cleverly before, and the door wasn't totally open, but now it's totally open, right? But over the 40 years since Ronald Reagan, and this is a process, right? This is not just Ronald Reagan. All these other Democrats have gone along with this, along the way, all the tax cuts for businesses and, all the free trade, and let's gut pensions, and let's shift the cost of healthcare, and let's create 50 million people who are part-time temp workers in this country, and pay them less, pay them a lump sum even when they're in the contract, create two-tier, wage structures in the unions, and eliminate and further constrict the right to strike along the way. All these things are concession bargaining. Let's expand management's rights clauses in contracts. Let's reduce union rights and worker rights clauses in contracts. If you look at the contracts, you can see the various clauses. All contracts have certain clauses in them. There's union rights, there's management rights, there's worker rights, union representative rights. And there's been a shift, not just in wages and benefit costs and job security, but there's a shift in these rights, which are very important along the way, including the right to strike, and one way you see weakness in the contract is when the penalties for management not abiding by the contract, penalties that exist in the contract, are eliminated as well. And we see them penalties on violations of the contract, penalties, cost penalties, you got to pay money if you violate seniority or promotions or whatever, right? Or layoff processes. All that gets eliminated as well. So concession bargaining has certain red lights and indicators, eliminate cost of living clauses, right? Shift the cost of benefits or eliminate benefits. And Democrats have been just as responsible for this. For example, in the 1990s, under Bill Clinton passed a rule that allowed companies, employers, to move money out of the pension fund so that the company can pay its share of rising healthcare insurance costs. They could take money out of the pension fund because it was ruled the pension fund is not the workers. The company owns the pension fund. You see, so they can do whatever they want. They get rid of the pension if they want. And a lot of them have done it. Big companies, union and non-union, they got rid of the defined benefit pension plans by dumping them on this government agency called the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, PBGC. They dump it. And then they go to 401ks, right? They dump it. And the PBGC reduces the amount of pension you would have gotten to about 55% of what you would have gotten if the company didn't dump their defined benefit plan, right? The airlines and banks and all these, under George Bush, this was a big thing. They dumped the IBM, they all dumped their pension plans, right? They all went to 401ks. So this is all part of concession bargaining. You can see this in the contracts. The cost shift, the penalties disappear, more part-time rights, workers and lump sums, and two-tier and lump sum are big indicators of concession bargaining in contracts. Two-tier and lump sum. Let's keep two citizens, two kind of work citizens classes in the companies in negotiations. The disappearing of union rights and this expansion of management's rights. These are all indicators, right? Job security. The company can move anything whenever it wants, right, to whatever, and the unions can't do anything about it. You can't even negotiate, severance for your members. These are all concession bargains, and this has been the rule. Steady concessions made from '79 up until recently. Right? If you look at these big negotiations and partially strikes and threat of strikes here in the past year, you see some of this has been stopped in its track. This is what's significant about the past year. In some of these big public visible negotiations, concession bargaining has even been reversed. You can see it in the Teamsters contract in particular, to some extent in the auto contract. Unfortunately, you don't see it in the railway workers contract. The railway workers contract was this time last year. The railroad workers threatened to go on strike. Nothing scares the capitalists more than a transport strike, because you couldn't shift transport offshore. You can't offshore transport, you see, just like you can't offshore government workers, but you can offshore manufacturing. And that's what they did to break the manufacturing unions, right? But the Teamsters union and the longshore workers, the dock workers, and the railroad workers, right? You can't offshore. And their power still exists. They've tried to control them by controlling their leadership, make sure that the union leadership in these industries is very compliant, and they did that for decades here in the Teamsters union, and, also in other unions, East Coast Longshore and so forth, control the leadership, and you can work through them to keep the lid on your workers, right? And that's the best they could do. There's some other things that they could do that they did, but that's the best they could do. But that has changed, the Teamsters changed their leadership here finally. When it gets bad enough, the workers, step in and, say we need leaders who who will look at our interests more than the interests of the companies or the interests of the Democratic Party. See, that's the problem. One of the big problems with unions and their weaknesses is that they are tied to the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party doesn't want the unions to embarrass them, especially when there's an election, by going on strike. So the Democrat Party leadership leans on the top union leadership, says, hey, you don't want to strike. You don't want to strike. You'll embarrass us, and we won't be in office, and we can't throw you any crumbs after that, right? so that's been part of the problem, but that's changed. The Teamsters Union, for example, and the new leadership, Sean O'Brien here this year, got a very good contract, and the Democrats wanted to participate, and Sean O'Brien, the new president of Teamsters, said, no, we don't want your help. Stay away, Joe Biden. We don't want your help. We can do this with UPS, right? And they did. They got a very good contract that sort of broke this trend here of concession bargaining. And you can see the improvements in the contract because they're eliminating in steps here the two-tier work structure, two-tier workers, a lot of part-time workers, right? And they're eliminating that. Now, companies need a certain amount of part-time workers sometimes, to fill in. And that's the case in UPS, right? Holidays and so forth, you need more part-time. But they abused it, and they created more and more people part-time because it was financially, attractive. They saved a lot of money with part-time, and the part-time workers didn't have as much rights in various ways. Well, the Teamsters have changed that, begun to change that, and they're rolling these part-time workers tens of thousands of them into full-time. Some of them immediately were changed into full-time based upon their seniority. And the way to really penalize companies for hiring part-time one way is to make sure that the part-time workers get all the same wages and benefits as the full-time. When you do that, there's no financial incentive for the company to hire part-timers, you see?
Mhm.
Make it a penalty to hire part-timers. And the Teamsters are doing that. They're moving people in. The wage structure is been significantly improved. You know, it's a 5-year agreement here. In my time, no one had more than a 3-year agreement. And I like to negotiate a 2-year agreement or sometimes a 1-year agreement. Like if I organize a company for the first time, you know, I tried to put most of the money in wage increases to get their wages up immediately, but have only a 1-year agreement. So you would come back in the second year and you would be able to attack, you know, the benefits and the other provisions that you wanted. Now that's a lot of extra work for the union representative, you know, but I was young, full of energy, and you know, full of piss and vinegar, as they say. And, you know, I didn't mind striking them every year if I had to, you know. You know, the Teamsters eliminated, they broke the back. They didn't give up any cost of living. You know, that's another indicator, right? There was no, from what I could tell, lump sum payment. So these indicators, the key indicators, concession bargaining, were not there in this contract. And we saw a lot of measures by which workers were brought off of this 2-tier into the main structure here in terms of wages and rights and benefits and so forth. In addition, everybody got pretty good wage increases. You know, the minimum wage increase was $7.50 an hour. Minimum wage increase, $7.50 an hour. Nobody making less than $21 an hour immediately, and within a year or two, $23. Everybody moved up, you know, and that's another sign when everybody gets the benefit. And there were other pay benefits, you know, and I won't go into detail. Service work and on call, and you know, if you had to use your own vehicle and so forth, there were lots of ways to get money, additional money. But workers would be making at least $30 plus all these fringe benefit wage additions in the contract by the 4th year. You know, it was a good settlement, you know, and very much unlike the settlements previously, you know. So the Teamsters are sort of a lodestone saying, you know, this is where we're going to go from now on, right? The railroad workers, though, they took it in the ear. Why? Because the government, Biden and the House Representative Pelosi, intervened and prevented the settlement that the workers probably could have got, right? And what was the key demand of the railroad workers last year? Their key demand was they wanted some paid sick leave. They had no paid sick leave at all. You know, they were able to use 1 or 2 personal leave days if they wanted for paid sick leave, but you know, 1 day a year, I mean, that's not enough for paid sick leave. They just wanted the minimum of 10 days paid sick leave. That was the number one demand. But the companies, the railroad companies, didn't even want to give that. Why? Because the railroad companies, after COVID, remember, you had during COVID, people weren't you know, buying a lot of stuff, certain stuff. Industries had shut down. There wasn't as much rail activity going on, railroad activity, shipping, right? And the railroad companies ended up with about 70% of their normal workforce during COVID, 70%. And when the economy was opened in 21, quote, COVID was over, right? They never hired people back. They kept working with a 70% normal labor force. Well, when you're working with a 70% normal labor force, you're making people work overtime all the time, and you don't want people to take off sick. But you're driving them, you're making them sick by working all that overtime. So you had a lot of pressure growing among railroad workers saying, hey, we need some time off here. You're killing us, right? And it was and the railroad companies making big bucks, big profits, because they weren't paying 30% of their wages and their normal wages. They're creating this stress situation. The union wanted paid sick leave. They didn't want to give paid sick leave, because if people start taking off sick and you've got this bare bones skeleton 70% labor force, you're going to have stoppages and problems, right? So there was a big fight over that. And the problem, though, in the rail is that you have 9 unions. Unlike the Teamsters, all the truckers are in one union, Teamsters union, right? You got 9 different unions based upon crafts, right? You got the locomotive engineers, you got the signalmen, got right-of-way workers, based upon their little occupations, right? And this has always been the history of the railroad workers in the 20th century. You have all these different unions, and management plays one against the other. And then we had this law passed in 1926 called the Railway Labor Act, which was really very restrictive. You couldn't strike virtually. You virtually could not strike. Since 1926, there's only been a few railroad strikes, and those were sort of illegal, That's how, and by the way, the 1947 Taft-Hartley for the rest of the country economy was in many ways based upon that 1926 anti-railroad strike legislation. So when it looked like the railroad workers were going to strike here, Joe Biden steps in, and Nancy Pelosi steps in and says, if you guys strike, we're going to pass even worse anti-strike legislation on you. And we may just extend that to everybody else in labor. Well, the heads of the rest of the unions started coming down on the railroad workers too. So, hey, what are you going to do? You're going to make it tough for us, with more anti-strike. You don't do this. Don't walk out. And then the companies and the government, sort of stripped off a couple of unions who settled quick. So you had 4 or 5 unions that might go on strike, but they were all divided and everything, and the threat of anti-strike. And to make the story short, they busted the strike.
Mm-hmm.
Joe Biden, the friend of labor, busted the railroad strike. This is part of this problem, of the unions being too close to the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, when push comes to shove, is not on their side. So the railroad workers was a defeat, very clearly, but they're probably learning some lessons about that. And next time around, we'll see whether they've learned the lessons. But they got to get rid of this fragmented nine craft union things. Back in the 19th century, there's only one railroad union. It was called the American Railway Union. And it struck in the 1870s and 1880s. It struck a lot of these big railroads, which were the big industries. They were the tech industries of the 19th century, right? They had some real knockdown, drag-out strikes. At some point, the workers seized the railroads, right? Seized the railroads, and some states had to call out the National Guard to break the union and everything. The ARU, American Railway Union, in 1890, right? They broke it. And ever since then, you get these fragmented unions in railway based upon occupations and crafts. Well, that's got to end. They got to become like the Teamsters, one big union, right? Or like the longshore workers on the East or West Coast, one union on the docks, right? Or one union in auto, right? That's the only way they're going to be able to come back. But what happened last year politically it was a political destruction of that strike and that negotiations, right? What you got in the Teamsters is a big contrast, saying, no, we don't want your help, stay away, right? And they do pretty good, but they're only one union. They got new leadership, right? Now, what you got in the auto workers strike, right, recently is also new leadership. New leadership has come in. Sean Fain is the new president. Some new militancy, but new militancy from below. And the auto workers know this shift to electric, is make or break the union. And they have a lot that they got to make up for, right? In 2019, the last negotiations, the union gave up a lot. They gave up their cost of living, I think it was then, or maybe it was a prior agreement, right? They agreed to more and more concessions. And, auto workers used to be top wage in American unions and American industry. You know what the average wage was in the auto industry? $18 an hour. Can you imagine working on an assembly line for $18 an hour? That's barely minimum wage. And the companies that really expanded part-time and temp workers in manufacturing, in auto manufacturing, and they moved half of their whole industry to Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
There were auto part companies. I forget the name of this company out of Dayton, Ohio, that had 100,000 workers in the US, 25 factories in the US. The whole thing moved to Mexico. The whole parts company moved to Mexico. Number one big part, I forget what it was, because of free trade and the tax incentives that we talked about. Right? So the auto workers union that used to be like 2 million people, only 400,000 now. And it an existential negotiations for them, right? Are they going to end this two-tier thing that weakens them? Are they going to require the companies to recognize the union in the new electric vehicle and battery plants, right? Big demands, so that the union can survive for another day. Will the union get a good enough settlement deal that they can go after the non-union foreign auto plants and some American auto plants in the South, your state, Tennessee, Kentucky, I think Alabama and South Carolina, this is where in the right to work states, right, where union is weaker. And a lot of it went to Mexico as well, right? Can the union now organize that? Well, you got to get a pretty good settlement to go to the workers in these places and say, hey, look, we're getting more, we did a pretty good job here. If you want to share in what we got, then join the union. Well, the auto workers have a big organizing drive going on now on these plants, these former, particularly the Japanese and German plants in the South, trying to unionize them. And these companies are scurrying around trying to raise their wages. Like Nissan, I heard, I think Nissan's in Tennessee or Kentucky, raise their wages almost as much as the union got here in negotiations with the big three auto companies. So we got this big battle going on. But now for the first time, the union's got something to sell to these workers. Before, all they had to sell was these defeats and retreats. So no one's going to be impressed with a union that's going backwards, right? That was the previous decades. But now they're going forward again, right? Now they've, got some important gains, and we'll see what they're going to be able to do with it. When you assess a union contract, you got to understand what's the conditions in which it's negotiated. If the economy is in a recession and its contract expires, it's probably not going to do as well, when the economy is poor. Did it hold the line when the economy was poor, or did it go backwards, right? or when the economy is good, did it have gains, or did it sort of just mark time and maybe even go backwards? It's all relative, based upon the conditions which exist. And you got to look at the negotiations, where the gains and losses, where they kept, were they losses, were they gains, but it depends on the conditions and the time. So in 2019, the economy was doing pretty good, and they gave up a whole lot, right? Now, what's happened here in the past year in these contract negotiations is that there's been a labor shortage because of COVID, you see, and a labor shortage gives union and workers an advantage. Part of the problem during the concession period was there wasn't a labor shortage because the companies had sent everything offshore, not everything, but a lot offshore. And now you got a workforce in auto, which is a global workforce. In other words, excess labor. And that makes it tougher in the US to negotiate, because now it's a global company. You see, opening up the US economy and expanding abroad has been a big factor in weakening labor. Before, in 1969-70, that wasn't the case. There was no offshoring that we're talking about, right? There was no two-tier workers. There was no part-time temp workers, right? Union rights and worker rights clauses were strong in these contracts. Seniority rights was strong. But then all that changed. You got to understand that the retreat, the great detour of labor from 79 up until recently, is the result of conscious political efforts on the part of big companies and their friends in government. This didn't happen by accident. Right? It was planned. It was planned. And of course, they developed and refined their plans along the way, but it was planned. It was a strategy, and it worked. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And part of the problem of labor did not check it and stop it because labor didn't act as one. The AFL-CIO in the 80s, their attitude, their leaders' attitude was, well, this is just Ronald Reagan, and we'll get rid of him next election, and it'll all go away. Well, it didn't go away. The Democrats, Bill Clinton and others, just continued this stuff, right? And Obama continued this stuff, right? And Biden is continuing this stuff. And in between, you got the Republicans who come in and really drive it home, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a problem that the Democratic Party is not the Democratic Party of your grandfathers, right? This is a new animal that changed in the late 90s when the corporate wing of the Democrat Party took over. It was called the Democratic Leadership Conference, the DLC, right? They took over that party, and they've been driving the strategy and the candidate selection of that party ever since. And it's moved to the right, very much moved to the right. It talks the talk about center and liberal, but it acts corporate because the leadership committee, the DNC, is dominated by big corporate money. And they keep a few visible liberals, like Bernie Sanders, who says he's not a Democrat. Of course he is. The Squad and so forth. They let them talk the talk. But when it comes time to take action, slam. They're put in their place. Right?
Mm-hmm.
In their place when the big issues, like we're going to prevent a railroad strike no matter what, right? And we're going to keep those corporate tax cuts that the $4.5 trillion that Trump passed in 2018. We're going to keep those. We're not going to chip away at that. We'll say that we are, but no. Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema, you veto it. Right? This is what goes on in the leadership. You take the lead, you stop the liberal progressive wing, Bernie Sanders, from grabbing and reversing some of those massive tax cuts for the rich to fund social programs, right? Block it, stop it. This is what goes on, behind the scenes. So that's part of the problem. The political relationship is part of the problem, right? The laws are part of the problem. Citizens United is part of the problem. Weak union leadership was part of the problem, right? Changing the nature of the labor markets is part of the problem. But this is all part of what we've seen up until recently. And the question now is, can the auto workers and the Teamsters, who have sort of led the way and said, this is where we're going now, maybe, can they break the back of concession bargaining? Well, we'll see. The jury is still out on this. There's certainly those two unions made significant gains in blunting these milestones of concession bargain. There have been gains, no doubt about it. Part-time, temp, two-tier, COLAs, and so forth, right? And it remains to be seen. Now, one last union that we've seen here in negotiations is a harbinger of things to come that aren't too pretty. And I'm talking about the writers and the actors strike. What this is about technology undermining labor and membership and union power even more. What is this? This is artificial intelligence coming into the negotiations. A little background. What is AI? A lot of confusion about artificial intelligence, right? Artificial intelligence is software, right? It's software that is able to make the machine, the software machine. It's software machines. It's not robots, right? Clunky things walking around. No, it's software on servers being able to become more and more efficient at its task. And as a result, enabling companies to replace a lot of their workers with software decision-making, right? Machines that, in a sense, can become more and more efficient at communicating with customers. Search engines and customer service and so forth. When you call up, you got a problem, right? You want to talk with a service rep or something like that, right? Or in retail, more and more online consumption and buying and so forth, but a lot of service support. And artificial intelligence, software machines, is made possible because of other technological advances. One is cloud computing. You don't have servers necessarily on your company. All your stuff is kept in the cloud, the internet cloud, as they call it, right? Cloud computing technology. Advanced statistical analysis, big databases, massive databases of information and cloud computing, and fast quantum computing, fast computing, where a software machine can drag out all the information in the cloud, right? And in your database and so forth. And software machines, the more they work, the better they get. And they can communicate with you using natural language, English. Now, what this means, bottom line, what artificial intelligence means is that simple decision-making by workers in services mostly, right, is now going to be done by machines, by software machines. Simple decision-making. And there are tens of millions of jobs of simple decision-making. A lot of part-time service workers, right? Their jobs are going to be replaced. Goldman Sachs, a big bank, has recently written a report, I think it was about a year ago, right? Estimating that AI is going to eliminate 300 million jobs by 2030, 300 million. Now that's globally, but most of those are going to be in the US, And you talk about self-driving cars, which will come, they'll come more first in local trucking, I believe, and in railroads, right? A lot of those jobs are going to be eliminated because of technology. Just like electric technology is going to eliminate a lot of auto jobs. Well, AI is going to eliminate a lot of service jobs, customer service reps, retail workers, accountants, and all of these back office jobs, are going to be done by machines, software machines, using big databases, using access to the cloud, using rapid retrieval. When you contact, now you can, a search engine, right, using AI, a search engine will talk to you. You won't just use a keyboard, it'll talk to you. So what do you want? Say, well, I want to know this and that, blah, blah, blah. And it'll go out and immediately search the internet in light speed time, find out your answer and print it out to you. Right? That's your answer. And you'll be able to communicate quickly with it. This is already here, right? And ChatGPT-4, Bard, and all these things, right? Well, what does this mean for actors and writers? It means the companies will be able to write the scripts using AI, and they won't need a real writer anymore. And the writers know this. Now, it won't eliminate everything, but it'll eliminate a lot. And a lot of writers' jobs, a lot of writers in TV and, on the internet and so forth, right? They're not just novelists, right? Their jobs are going to really be threatened, be gone. The quality of the shows you get are going to be more boring, but the companies will push them on you because it's much more profitable, because it's a highly skilled service employee and intensive industry and work. And the writers knew this, and the writers were on strike for months, right? They didn't win. They didn't win. What about the actors? What does this mean for actors? Well, it means that, a lot of the work in acting behind the actual actors is going to be done by AI. You're not going to need them as much. And it means images, right? AI will create images, and the background of, green screens and all that stuff, won't be done by workers in the actors union, because the actors union is not just actors, on stage, it's all these people behind. And eventually they're already moving in the direction. We're going to have fake actors. They're not going to be real human beings. Initially, they will be representations of actual actors, and the actual actors will get a royalty, right, for using their face, whatever, on screen. And maybe it'll be a mix of them and the fake, but eventually it will mean that a lot of the actors will not be around. They know that long term too. Certainly, maybe not the stars of the show, right? But a lot of the extras and a lot of this, and that's where a lot of employment is, will be gone. Will be gone. Editing, you don't need editors, when you have AI and a lot of these other, well, they know this. But the problem is that the actors and the writers did not win their strike, right? The companies kept AI. There's some token, requirements to let the writers know, but the writers wanted residuals, and the actors wanted residuals. In other words, you got to pay us for it, like a royalty. You write a book, you get a royalty, right? Or in Europe and other places in the world, you write an article, you'll get paid for it. In the U.S., you don't get paid for it. Anyone can steal your articles, right? But in Europe, if someone reproduces your article, they have to pay into a fund, and then that's distributed at the end of the year. But we don't have that in North America. We just rip everybody off here, right? Well, anyway, a lot of that's going to be gone, and the writers and actors know that, and they lost. And it's all artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, artificial intelligence is going to be the key, well, it already is really in sensor technology, to self-driving cars, right? And trucks. It's going to start in local trucking, self-driving trucks. That's coming. They got some glitches they got to get over, but there's 1 million truck drivers in this country. How many of them are going to lose their job to self-driving trucks? We'll see. But it's coming faster than people think. Now, part of the problem with AI is that it's still not quite smart. This is called generative AI, Chat GPT. In other words, it'll only do what you program it to do, what a human programs it to do. But it will do that more and more efficiently, faster, better, with fewer errors than a human being, and it will work 24/7. There's no breaks, right? No lunch breaks. You don't get sick. This engine doesn't get sick, and it's not like human beings, so it's much more profitable. That's Chat GPT, but we're coming on a new era, what's called general AI. And I believe that's coming by 2030. General AI is where the software machines self-maintain themselves. In other words, they can correct their own software code themselves without intervention by a human being. They can upgrade their software code, and at a certain point, they will be able to make a qualitative leap where they decide what questions to try to resolve. In other words, it's not just simple decisions pre-programmed that they perform. They may change their decisions. They may change their own software. The machine, will be able to upgrade itself to not just educate itself within the confines of what was defined for it to do. It will decide to do other things. And that's the scary part of AI. And that's what, some of these high-tech, people like Musk and others are worried about. Because think about it. If you program a missile, right, to attack Russia or someplace, or China, right? And you tell them, you tell the missile, well, if certain anti-missile signals start coming your way, move this way, or use this anti-missile tactic or something. That can be all pre-programmed, which it is already, right? But what happens when the missile can make its own decision about where it wants to go, right? I mean, that opens up possibilities that are really scary, I mean, this is sort of leading. You remember that old movie? What the heck was it? I can't remember, with Schwarzenegger. Terminator 2, Skyfall, or whatever whatever that kind of thing, with machines on their own, right? Machines on their own. Well, that's where general AI may be going. Now, they say it's not here yet. It's just generative AI. And it can't merely make its own decisions. It only will work on this, perform the decisions told it, and communicate with people in natural language, right? Well, I think in the 2030s, we will see general AI. And that will mean even more jobs eliminated. You see, because the thing with AI is the more it performs, the more it does a task, the smarter it gets, the faster it can do it with fewer errors. Therefore, it's more productive over time. And when it starts to be able to upgrade itself, well, then, that's exponential. Human beings can't learn as fast and upgrade themselves as the machines will be able to do. Anyway, that means a lot more lost jobs, and we're moving into a period where the entertainment industry is going to be more and more technological driven. And as a result of that, less and less human beings involved in entertainment. And you won't be able to tell the difference between a novel written by a real person, or a play written by a real person, and a play written by a software machine.
Mm.
And we're damn close to that right now. Scripts, the scripts for these TV shows, right? The software will know what people like.
Mm-hmm.
Will write what a show with the characters in the script that people like. The problem with that is we're going to get locked into no new creativity. It's going to be a lot of the old stuff over and over again, right? And it'll be kind of boring, I think. Anyway, that's the problem with that area, and there's a lot of jobs in that area. And AI is going to destroy, as Goldman Sachs says, and a lot of other reports, McKinsey and so forth report. It's going to get rid of millions of jobs. And now we've got 50 million people in this country working part-time temp jobs, low-paid service-type jobs, right? Barely getting by, gig jobs, have to work 2, 3 of these, to make ends meet. Well, those are the jobs that are going to be gone. And what happens to those people who are growing in number because the population is growing, right? Entry level. Where are they going to work? What are we going to do with tens of millions of people structurally unemployed permanently, right? That's a big problem going forward. I see the American and global capitalist system in deep trouble here by 2050. One, this problem. What are you going to do with these tens of millions of more unemployed or partially employed people, right? Already it's a problem. And then secondly, second big challenge is going to be the environmental challenge. I don't see them getting ahead of the curve on global warming and climate change. Recently had one of these global meetings, COP23, they call it, right? They're not making the necessary investments in order to get ahead of this curve. We're already at 1.4% centigrade increase, and we predicted we wouldn't get to 1.5 until 2040. We're already almost there, right? And we're seeing changes in the weather as a result.
Mm-hmm.
Fires and floods and tornadoes and so forth are getting worse, right? Hurricanes. We're going to hit 2 point centigrade increase well before 2050, I think. And they're losing control of it. And the big threat is methane. The tundra up north is thawing out, and methane is 40 times worse than CO2. 40 times in terms of global warming, right? And they're about to lose that control of that. They're going to miss their objectives. Well, you add, millions, tens of millions of jobs lost to technology, and then you add that on top of it. That's a big threat. The third big threat, I think, and the subject of my next book, is the American global empire is in decline.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have time really to talk about that, but it's in decline, and the U.S. elite is reacting violently to that decline and pushing wars here and there, trying to solidify the empire once again. A mistake's going to be made somewhere. When you put U.S. nuclear weapon capability in Ukraine and you have the Russians with the same, somebody's going to make a mistake. It's not going to be a conscious thing, well, let's use nuclear arms here, but somebody's going to make a mistake. And as a U.S. empire comes under economic empire, global hegemony comes under greater threat and retreat, it's going to get more desperate. So those are the three things I'm most worried about long term. For us and our families going forward. And in the meantime, the labor movement has this great struggle going on. The unions to maintain their existence and the employers trying to keep it down and compressing the wages and benefits and standard of living of the American working class, which is going on. I'll finish with this. What are the big reports going on in the media, the mainstream media, by Biden administration and others. They can't figure out the economy is supposed to be so good, but yet you got 70–80% of the people saying, hey, it's not so good. And only 28% in polls of American people saying Biden's doing a good job on the economy. Only 28%. And of course, he's way behind Trump, who's doing nothing except sitting there and letting the Democrats throw more legal crap at him, right? And every time they do, he gets stronger, right? We're entering a period of renewed here, 2025, even 24, renewed political instability in this country. You think 2020 was a problem? You ain't seen nothing yet. Okay. And that's a problem, and that we're all facing. In the meantime, more and more people are going to lose their jobs long term. Occupations are going to disappear. Unions are fighting for their existence. Wage compression is going on. Real wages and earnings are under they haven't risen really in 40 years. So that's the way I see going forward politically, economically. And the unions are struggling for their existence within the context of all those changes.
Dr. Rasmus, I'm sorry, but we have to go. But we would definitely have you back on soon. But I want to give you a second to plug in any of your information from our audience. And we want to say thanks again for coming back onto Kiko's Freethinkers Forum. This is an unbelievable episode 84. Some of the stuff that you were describing earlier about the unions and the history, just it leads to way more questions than answers sometimes. But I'm sure that we will pick up where we left off on this episode 84 at a later time. But are there any final words that you have and final plugs before we go?
Yeah, I just said that history isn't written, it's to be written. And, on a positive note, none of this is going forward is guaranteed. I talked about these three great threats. It can be changed. It's not etched in concrete, and people have to put away. I would finish with this: put away the little petty issues. Both sides keep us distracted. I call it a great distraction. With wokeism and conspiracy theories. On the left and right, whatever. This is all part of keeping all of us distracted from the real issues that I've been trying to talk about, right? And people have to break, I believe, from both of these wings of this corporate party of America, because they're just two wings engaged in a food fight, right? And have to form some kind of independent political movement on the real issues of the day, not these little identity politics and people running around with pushing their own little issue here, and fragmented and so forth. We have to come together, and we have to form a real movement here. And from that movement, then we can create a political party, right? You can't do it top down, right? So that would be my last word to everybody. And, that's what I'm trying to write about as well. Check out my blog, jackrasmus.com. Watch my radio show on Fridays, Alternative Visions, on the Progressive Radio Network, 11 a.m. Follow me on Twitter at drjackrasmus. And for what it's worth, I'm throwing my ideas into the pot.
Thank you so much again. And I'm sure that our audience will have some questions for you later, and I will direct them to you accordingly if they have more directed questions. But thank you so much again for joining us and spending your time to talk with us, enlighten us, educate us, and we can't wait to have you back on.
My pleasure, anytime. Let's keep the discussion going.
No doubt. We're definitely going to do that. Beautiful people, enjoy the rest of your day, and we will talk soon. Cheers.